Hey everybody, I'm back. I usually don't have guests because I'm a little bit antisocial, but I'm really delighted to have Joshua Swamidass joining us today. So Dr. Swamidass is a computational biologist, physician, and an academic and an associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. I frankly don't even know what most of that is, so I know I'm in over my head already. And he's also the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry, published by University Press. I think that was about a year ago that came out. Has got a lot of buzz. Definitely check that out. Now, Professor Swamidass was recently on Capturing Christianity with Cameron Bertuzzi and talking about progressive Christianity and my recent book, and also Alyssa Childers and her book and some other things. And so I wrote an article responding to that, and we thought that we would hash things out further here. So that's the introduction. Josh, is it okay I call you Josh?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Or Dr. Josh or however you want to do it.
I've already, it reminds me when I was in England at King's College studying, then there was a professor there called Martin Stone was his name. I always called him Martin. And then after I got my PhD, he told me, now you can call me Martin. So I was like, oh, because that's how the English tell you something that they didn't like something. They wait for 2 years and then tell you indirectly.
Yeah, no problem. That's
Okay.
Hey, it's great to talk to you. Like I said, and I really meant a lot of the positive things I said about your work. I mean, I really appreciated your voice. I mean, I really think your book on "Is the Atheist My Neighbor" really should be read by more people. I think it was really well thought out, and I hope that plug gave you a little boost in sales. And if not, I mean, I just really think more people should read that book.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I will put a link, by the way, to the conversation you had with Cameron below for context. But yeah, you said some good things about that book. You seem to be less positive about progressive Christians love Jesus too, and I mean I'm fine with that. I mean, obviously, people aren't gonna. You know as an author that you give when you read a book, it's like having a child or something. You're a little defensive of your child, but you also understand not everybody's going to like your child. And the thing is, if somebody is like has mixed feelings about your child, you'd like to know why. So that sort of was part of I didn't find there's a clear critique of the book coming through in your
I didn't.
conversation.
My talk wasn't meant to critique your book, and I mean I said that right up front. I mean I'm not going to be giving a detailed critique of these two books, and so I gave an assessment that was very short. And I'm happy. It's not that I'm dodging you. I'm happy to explain it more. Um, but I will say before we get too far, I want to be really clear that there's a couple parts of your thesis that I entirely agree with. You're saying that, I mean, your title is that progressive Christians love Jesus too. I think that's true. I think you're saying that they're Christians too. I think that that's true. So, I mean, I agree with you on those points, and I think that if anyone um, thinks, is trying to take, the argument that you guys are not Christian, well, I think they're missing some really big things here.
Yeah.
And so that part I entirely agree with you on. I think that, I mean, you've emphasized over and over again that was your main point. Well, if that was your main point, well, I agree with that.
I would say I've gotten someone I remember like they criticized the book because they said, well, not all progressive Christians love Jesus. And so this is maybe a good occasion for me to say, reiterate that my claim isn't something so robust as to say everybody who calls themselves a progressive Christian loves Jesus. Just like I don't know that every evangelical, right,
Yeah.
actually loves Jesus. So I mean, my point is not to swing from one simple binary that these are all fake Christians to, well, these are all genuine Christians. It's a diverse group. You're going to have wheat and tares, to use a biblical term, just like in any other community. Um, now, but see
But I would say
this,
even if they don't have the right theology from a lot of really important definitions of Christians, they're still Christians.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's so, I mean, even if you don't think they have a saving faith, even if they don't even affirm the resurrection, by sociological definition, they're totally Christian. So I mean, that's not the right language to be using, anyways.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can use different definitions of Christian, like you said, a sociological or a theological one. Uh, but anyway, so then that just brings us, it does bring us back to, I mean, this is the central thesis of Childers' book, is to say, well, these people are not Christians, they are another religion. So one of my basic questions to you then, before we move into other areas, do you think that when she teaches that repeatedly, that progressive Christians are another religion, and that when leading Christians like Sean McDowell and Lee Strobel enthusiastically endorse her thesis, does that do harm to the Christian community?
Uh, well, yeah, I do think that does. Though, I mean, you might want to reach out to have some dialogue with Sean McDowell or Elise Strobel about that,
Oh, I've asked them, they haven't responded.
and to see to what extent they would moderate that. Because I'll tell you that, uh, like, I agree with your disagreement with Alyssa on that argument, or Lisa on that argument. But there's other really positive things about that book that maybe she is talking that they're really emphasizing when they endorse it. And so, that can be a place where you can have people who are really in her camp agreeing with you on this point that's really important to you. And that would be good for you. So I think it's worth really, pursuing that and kind of creating a little more space um, for that sort of mediated endorsement.
Yeah, again, I've reached out to Lee Strobel and to Sean McDowell multiple times, and they haven't responded. So I don't think they're interested. But I mean, there's when I reviewed her book, I noted, for example, that she used a good illustration of peach cobbler with respect to evaluating theological claims and so on. I don't remember exactly what the context was, but I did highlight that. I thought, well, that's a good teaching illustration. There's some legitimacy there. But the central thesis of her book is false and harmful. And so when Lee Strobel writes forward for it and endorses the view that progressive Christians are not Christians at all, I think he's culpable for promoting a book that has a central thesis that is false and harmful. Same thing when Sean McDowell gives it an unqualified endorsement.
Well, I mean, I just don't think that that's really the totality of her book. I mean, you're looking at it from a particular angle, which is understandable, but I think that there's a lot of good in her book too. Um, I think it also is important that she's not an academic. She is she's kind of a layperson who's written a book that's been really well received. I don't think anyone really expected it would have done this well as it did. Um, and there's a lot in the book that really could use better nuance and clarity. And and so, I mean, that is what it is. There's a difference between a layperson writing a book like this versus an academic. There's like higher standards. So, um, you know, I'm an academic. You're an academic. I think we expect a certain level of precision and clarity and footnotes and all that sort of stuff. That doesn't usually happen in most Christian writing. I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, we can dislike that. I mean, I dislike it, but I don't know if she's necessarily unique in that.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say this about that she's a non-specialist, and then we could move on. If a person wants to say, well, she doesn't know all sorts of things, and she's ignorant of the things she's talking about, and that's a mitigating factor in terms of her culpability for otherwise distributing false information, I'll say, okay, it doesn't make the book less bad, but it may mitigate her culpability. Whereas
I'd
if
say a
she were an
lot.
academic, you would expect that she would know some of the things, such as that penal substitutionary theory of atonement is not the doctrine of atonement.
Look, I would just say that this is a common issue in a lot of Christian books, including among progressive Christians, um, that they do a much better job at describing themselves and their own beliefs and their own experience than they do at describing the beliefs and experiences of other people. Um, this is like a pretty common failure, and I'd say that a lot of that. I mean, a lot of what we've seen in progressive Christian books have had that failure to destructive effect in the church too. and they're not going back and retracting their points and things too. So I mean, I think that, you know, it's a bit of calling the pot calling the kettle black on this. I mean, when I wrote my book, I was really really cautious about this. I had it reviewed by everyone who disagreed with me. Like over 100 scholars gave feedback on my book, and I also established an erratum for it. And when errors were found out in the book, I really quickly corrected them publicly. And then when we had a new edition of the paperback, like the publisher agreed to actually fix all the erratums I made. I don't know really if many other Christian authors have done anything remotely like that. And and so because of that, I do think I am, really accurately not just describing my own beliefs, but the beliefs of others. But that's just not what happens typically in Christian books, um, and that's just a problem. A lot of the books that are important in progressive Christianity, they make pretty negative claims about traditional Christianity, historical Christianity, and conservative Christianity that are not accurate, and that's been very destructive to the church. And frankly, some of them made really, and I'm a scientist, some of them have made really inaccurate statements about science that have been very destructive in the church, that's been really bad. But I I'm kind of at a loss because I just don't think any of this is really good. I think we need to have a better sort of approach to this, and to have better conversations across these differences, so that we're not only describing ourselves well, but we're actually accurately characterizing other people.
Yeah, I certainly your book is a model for that kind of meticulous methodology, and that's a fascinating detail, how you track the errata that were identified within the book. Um, Now, when you said pot calling the kettle black, I don't think that I'm myself responsible for doing the kind of thing that Childers does. And I would certainly call out that same behavior whenever it happens in any other book of which I was aware. So I think that's a little bit of a sidebar. Now, if I were to take
Well,
you to
not
say,
not not. It's not as far from this as you might expect. I mean, that's been the criticism, for example, of Pete Enns' book, and also McLaurin's book as well, which are the books that Alisa is really criticizing. Um,
what about which book of Pete Enns, and what specifically are you referring to?
there was a book, I think, if, I was just going over. I mean, I just reread it this last week, but now I'm blanking on the name of it. Let me just check my Kindle. Do you mind?
Sure.
um, but she discusses this too, where it talks about the First Corinthians 10 passage, where it talks about the rock um, that was following them in the desert, and it was a legend.
Mhm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if I recall, uh, he in his one book on scripture, he talks about this as an epiphany when he was doing his PhD or something to that effect. Is that right?
Yeah,
About how Paul had a theological interpretation of the passage.
yeah. The Bible tells me so.
Yeah. Okay.
Why defending Scripture has made us unable to read it. Yeah. So have you read Greg Beale's uh, back and forth with Pete Enns over his work?
No, about that specific issue. That's that segment there you're talking about.
Well, it's about his entire work that comes up there. And he wrote a book called, that's actually a good part of the book is about the back and forth between Pete Enns and him. It's called Erosion of Inerrancy in Evangelicalism.
Oh, I read that book years, but that book came out long before Pete's book.
Well,
I think you're probably I think in that book he's just responding to inspiration and incarnation.
yeah, that's right. That's the one too. So I mean, those are the
Yeah,
two books.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
So
I don't, as I recall Beale's book, which I did read like 10 years ago. I mean, I don't think Beale's inerrantist critique of Vans was particularly successful, but I think that's a legitimate scholarly debate. I don't think that places inspiration and inerrancy or incarnation on anything like the same level as Schilder's book, which is a fundamentally false thesis at its very heart.
well, I mean, just to give you an example, this is where if I had reviewed um, Elisa's book, there's a whole chapter where she goes into that that statement by Enns. I mean, I think it's the book on authority problems, and she kind of explains how progressives view scripture, and she explains kind of his reasoning there. Um, like, I really agree with her that his reasoning is really weak there. Um, I think that her case would have been a lot stronger by referring to Greg Beale's critique instead of a lot of the ways how she explained it afterwards. I mean, I think Greg Beale, is a scholar that you might disagree with him, but there's a lot more nuance and clarity in what he's saying. And one of the points that Greg Beale makes, which I think is a fair one, because I've seen this not just in the narrow case of Pete Enns in that book, but on several other cases with progressives, is that basically they're primarily taking non-evangelical interpretations of scripture as a starting point without even really engaging the historical evangelical approaches to them, and just kind of coming up with a new approach that doesn't even engage how other evangelical scholars have been doing it. and that's just not good scholarship. Greg points out several times, he's doing this without any footnotes, without any engagement with how other people who are other, conservative evangelicals are. A lot of times I feel like, it seems like I should say, that progressive Christianity has been a reaction against the fundamentalist strains of Christianity, that, without really engaging, thoughtful conservatives along the way. And ends up kind of going, I would say they probably inherit a bit too much from liberal Christianity as a result. Now, it's one thing to kind of take a principled look and a step towards that, and if you can make the case, but it's really not convincing when you don't engage, thoughtful conservatives along the way. And to be clear, I'm not talking about political conservatives at all. We're talking entirely about theological stuff, right? And so we're not talking about Trump voters. We're not talking about Republican or Democrat or anything, bound to the United States that way. Or I'm talking about, theological conservatives. And that's been a consistent observation that people have made that has been pretty frustrating for conservative scholars, because it seems like a lot of the moves that are made are pretty dramatic and also very unnecessary. And I think that really comes down to a pretty fundamental problem with repeatedly not engaging, the other side in a charitable way. Now, and honestly, I think that that's destructive. I think it's highly destructive. That's part of the reason why I think Greg Beale gets really frustrated in what he writes about Pete Enns. And to Pete Enns' credit, there has been a back and forth with them in the scholarly literature, but that hasn't really filtered through at all to how he engages the public. I mean, this has been, like I said, this has been a pretty consistent problem that has been, or like a failure of dialogue, if you want to put it another way, between progressive Christians and other part of evangelicalism, where it really gets reduced down to fundamentalism, everyone that they disagree with, rather than realizing there's people out there that are educated, that have a nuanced view of all these things, and that disagree with them, and are more conservative. And if they did a better job characterizing us, they might be more convincing.
Yeah, I appreciate the analysis. I think it's pretty high level, and it's kind of a little bit difficult to engage in a sense, because it's like, if you're if are there progressive Christians who should have engaged with certain conservative voices when they were doing their theological deconstruction of some paradigms that they'd received at an earlier period in life? No doubt there are such people, just like there are
Oh, no,
evangelical.
that's not what we're talking. We're talking about their public work that they're engaging the church on. So
Sure.
Greg
Yeah.
Beale is taking Pete Enns to task on his public-facing work. He calls it even misleading, and he's doing that not in a narrow way, but in a very precise way, saying, "Hey, look, you're making this argument, saying that there's a universal consensus on this passage, but that's not true." And you're not engaging these people who disagree with you, and you're saying that way, and the people who are in the church who aren't scholars don't have the tools to understand that what you're saying is not true. That's really misleading. That's what
I will just say, I mean, I can't. It's been 10 years since I read Beale's book, although at the time I wasn't impressed, but that's just a subjective recollection. But I will say, Inspiration and Incarnation was a critically acclaimed book, had a second edition, which also received glowing praise. Actually, in my book, The Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, I cite Tremper Longman, who gives a glowing endorsement, and he's no progressive, but he gives a glowing endorsement of Inspiration and Incarnation. So are there things you can critique in that academic? Well, it's not an academic work, but it's a taking academic ideas and presenting them to a popular audience. Are there things you could criticize in that? Sure. But just like you can criticize all sorts of things in other more evangelical authors.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, the place.
yeah.
I mean, I'm not like I don't want to make this entirely about Pete Enns. I'm just giving that as an example. And by the way, that comes with, I would say, look, this isn't just about Pete Enns. I really don't know if I mean, I would say I don't agree with how Alisa, like how she lands and how she describes it. I just think it's not really precise, and maybe even a little reactionary to him how she responds to him on that. Like I don't think he's right in his reasoning, but her response is really just not is not is not precise enough. It's not nuanced enough, and it has a lot of problems. So, in the end, I think they're really just talking past each other, if that makes sense.
Uh, well, I don't know that Pete was talking to her, so he wasn't hasn't had much of an interaction with her, but again, like she says, progressive Christianity is a new religion and a false religion. That's not true. She accuses these people of being relativists about truth. That is demonstrably false. As I point out in the book, the statements that she interprets as relativism about truth are actually demonstrating a humility, an epistemic humility, and a recognition that we don't have a God's eye point of view. Um, she says that progressives are Marcionites and Gnostics. That's flatly false, and she has absolutely
Well, to be
tendentious
certain, she doesn't
definitions.
quite say that you're Gnostic, though I do agree with you. She basically, and I went on Capturing Christianity, which is pretty friendly to her, saying that Pete Enns is not a Gnostic. Okay, because like I think that there's many reasons to disagree with Pete Enns and progressive Christians, but because you guys are Gnostic, that's not the reason why. And you're right in your argument. She says that basically what they're doing is they're adding new knowledge to the gospel, and that makes them Gnostic. But that's really a misunderstanding of what's going on. She kind of transposes secret knowledge with new knowledge,
Yeah, exactly.
and I would also say one of the core features of Gnosticism was denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So I don't think you can make any parallel to Gnosticism and anyone else without being very clear that they affirm the resurrection if they do. Um,
And the goodness of embodied or material existence.
yeah, so I mean, you could say, for example, that Mormonism really relies a great deal on secret knowledge. So in that sense, in that narrow sense, it's very Gnostic. But to be clear, they do affirm the resurrection. That would be a fair way to say it, I think. But that's not what she did, and I think uh, that's that's unfortunate. It's very
Yeah,
unfortunate.
see, like this is a good example where it's not simply a lack of clarity or precision in what she says. It's that what she says is flatly false, and it's harmful. When you throw out incendiary labels like Gnostic or Marcionite, and you use these false definitions of the terms and then use those to smear entire groups, that's extremely harmful.
Well, look, I think that happens. Look, I've seen the same thing from progressive creations. I think the issue, though, is that this is where I, I'll give you credit, Randall, that we have our disagreements, but you're actually willing to have a conversation about them. And I think if you're going to make claims like that, on some level, you should engage with the people that you said that about. Um, and so she I think she's not. I mean, I just think though that Randall, she's not an academic. I think the reality is that like for example, a toe-to-toe debate with you is not going to happen. I think what I would hope is that she would sit down with some other scholars and maybe give a written response on things. And so, and look, in my own work, I've pulled back stuff at times, and said, hey, I wrote this and I was wrong. And not only that, I didn't make stealth edits. I put it in erratum. And that erratum is still online, so people can see it even after changes have been made in that, so they can, I mean, there's a public record for posterity of the mistakes I made, okay? Because I think that that's necessary for, good scholarship and basic kindness, when that happens. I think that that's what not just Alisa should do because her book is so bad. That's not the issue. I think that's what all Christians should be doing with their scholarly work, especially when it engages with others. That's what I hope she does. I don't think she's going to go. And frankly, I don't even know how much of an impact it would be to do a single interview with you on capturing Christianity. If she and not just her, if other Christians too were doing that with their own work, I think we'd be in a far, far better place. Does that make sense, Randall?
Sure. I mean, the difference would be that when you captured errata within your book, you could say, maybe there's this detail here, there's this detail here. She would have to pull back her whole thesis. So it would be a matter not of revising the book, but of ceasing publication of it and writing a new book. Because
Well,
at the very
maybe.
heart of the book,
Well, maybe. I don't know.
the
I mean,
title is another gospel.
well,
And it's
there's many
arguing
ways.
that
There's many ways to think about handling it. I don't want to micromanage that. Like I would be fine with her, you know, doing anything in that direction. Frankly, because most authors don't do anything. Okay. But look us, there's other books that have had their entire thesis completely, fall apart in progressive Christianity, and they still publish them and still promote them. So, I mean, you're not going to get much sympathy from me on that point until you start kind of addressing that in the other direction.
till I don't understand what you just said.
Look, it's
Uh,
easy. It's easy to rail against people that you disagree with and want them to kind of have higher standards on this stuff. It's a lot harder to ask for the same thing for the people in your camp. I'm just saying that. Look, I think
Who's in
I
my
told you what
camp?
I think Alisa should do, or not just Alisa. Really, I think all Christians should do. But I'm telling you that this is not just a problem with conservative Christians.
Yeah, but you seem you're back to use the language earlier of pot calling the kettle black, which I pointed out wasn't apposite because that suggests hypocrisy on my part, and I believe there is no such hypocrisy. And now again, you're kind
Oh,
of going
I
back
don't
to
think that
that.
this
You're just
is.
let me finish. You're going back to that talking point because you're saying you'd have more sympathy with what I'm saying about her withdrawing publication of the book if I were consistent in critiquing other people, quote, in my camp that I disagree with. But I don't have a camp, and whenever I see something that I think is false or harmful, I call it out. I think I'm pretty consistent there. Do you
Well,
disagree?
let me be clear here. I'm not actually saying that you're a hypocrite. Like I don't, hypocrite is like if for me, if I'm going to call someone that, that's not just lack of awareness. I think it's like fairly transparent and conscious double standardness, and I don't think that that's what's going on. So,
Well, you can be a hypocrite without being aware you're being a hypocrite. I mean, in fact, when Jesus warns about the plank in your own eye, the point is, I think, or certainly implied, is that a person's not aware that they have this plank in their own eye. So you need not be imputing intention to me by saying I'm being inconsistent. And it did sound like, I mean, I think you were saying that I
well,
should be
I
calling
think
out
what there
people in
is
my
to
own
me
camp.
is kind of like a lot of us them thinking, where there's an out group and an in group, and this is not just you or just your camp. I mean, I think this is almost kind of what it means to be human, right? um, where we when there's people in your in group, you tend to give them a lot more passes on stuff, and when there's people in your out group, you tend not to, and to be a lot more picking at it. And that's just the reality, right? And so. Um, and of course the biggest in group is ourselves, right? How we treat ourselves. We're just much more likely to treat our own work with that type of with those types of soft gloves than we are to treat our our enemies, right? And and we just have to work against that for fairness. So I think it's not surprising that this has just been a constant. This is like one of the things that really is on both sides, I think. um, I know most about origins. Okay, so that's the place where I really entered this. And for me, like I came from a very conservative Christian background. I would actually say a more fundamentalist background. and I kind of encountered evolution, and that's how I really started to change my views and thinking about things. But I really moved to a much more historically grounded Christianity. It was more informed. It was more in touch with the traditions of the church. It was still Protestant and all that. I didn't become a Catholic, but I really found out, oh, like this kind of fundamentalist approach to Christianity isn't even historical Christianity.
Yeah.
Um, but when I started working with Biologos, that's when I first really encountered a large number of progressive Christians, and I was really a minority there. I mean, I would maybe even unique in some ways in terms of working with them. And I got to tell you, man, I was not treated well. And so much of the time I spent was trying to kind of point out, not all conservative Christians are fundamentalists. There are actually conservative Christians that are thoughtful, that have come to terms with this in different ways. And that was like a category that didn't really even exist for them in a lot of ways. I remember I got really strong negative reactions merely for just telling people that I affirmed the Lasan covenant because of what it said about inerrancy. And I'm like, what do you have a problem with this minor statement? And they had such an allergic reaction, in large part from reading books like Pete Enns. That I mean, it was just such a strong negative and condescending reaction, kind of like I just didn't understand what I was talking about, which is not the case. Okay. And I think the place where I got the most concerned is how science was being deployed, where, Biologos really was really misrepresenting, knowingly or unknowingly, that's for them to figure out. But they were really misrepresenting the scientific evidence about Adam and Eve, not about common descent. There really is good evidence that we share common ancestors with the great apes. And to the point, where there are books that they've had that are, I'd say, it's accurate to say the central thesis of the books are entirely wrong, but they've issued no erratums and are still promoting those books. And I think it's incredibly destructive to the church. So that's kind of my context. And the reason why they've given me for that is because because they really think it's that conservative Christianity has to change, and it's not really that hopeful to correct the science on those things, because it'll just confuse people to think that conservative Christianity doesn't have to change. That's what they've told me, and so I really think that that's an issue, and that's how I would say those are my most salient experiences with progressive Christianity. And I'm not saying that. I can get as specific as you want me to on those things. And so when I see that, it's very hard to be too critical of Alisa on this stuff, because I can see
they're doing it so she can do it.
I would wish that she shouldn't. I wish that she wouldn't. I already told you what I wish she would do.
Yeah, like if you wrote a book critiquing one of those books you've just referenced and said, these are the reasons this book's thesis is false, why it's harmful, I wouldn't say to you, yeah, but why didn't you write a book about something else? I would say, okay, I'm going to evaluate that book on its own terms. So, I agree with you on that. I just don't think that
your book, what I think is interesting about it is, if we scale back her thesis to what I think is defensible, she is not saying, she shouldn't say that you're not Christian, okay, or that you're not saved, or that or I think even saying it's another gospel is, maybe it works for a title, but it has to be so qualified as not to mean that when you get down farther, or at least to allow for the fact that many progressives are preaching the same gospel. But the way I would put it is that, progressive Christians are a different type of Christianity in important ways, in the same way that there are different types of denominations. That's not necessarily a negative statement. That's even how they've described themselves. The way how Brian McLaurin
we have to be careful when we say they. You are, relative to some people and their categorizations, a progressive Christian in virtue of, as you said a moment ago, recognizing common ancestry with the great apes. So if to some degree we could begin to concede a little more that progressive Christianity is not some reified creedal system of belief, but rather is a spectrum and we're all to some degree on the spectrum relative to other
Well,
people,
I
then
mean,
we could break down the
theologically,
in-group,
I'm far
out-group
more
thing.
aligned with conservative Christians than I am with progressive Christians, and so it wouldn't. I think that's part of why.
I
That's
don't
part of
think
why
Ken
my
Ham
work
would
is
be very
actually
happy with you.
with them too, is because uh, when I talked about evolution, it hasn't come with wholesale revisions of their theology. It's really come in a way that makes sense within conservative Christianity.
Yeah, but the
So,
young Earth creationists aren't going to say that. So I mean, it
well, I
depends
don't
who you
know. I mean,
ask.
I don't
That's
know
my
about
point.
that. I actually don't know about that. I think I actually don't know about that. There are actually several Earth creationist leaders that I know that have said things along those lines.
Well, I remember, for example, when I was at a conference some years ago at well, not AAR, ETS, and so I think it was ETS, and then they were going to feature a panel, and they're going to have Biologos, and they're going to have, I think, Hugh Ross, Reasons to Believe, and then they wanted to have someone from Answers in Genesis, and Answers in Genesis refused to participate. Um, so, I mean, I don't think that Answers in Genesis is going to be on
Yeah,
board,
but Answers in
recognizing that
Genesis
you're a conservative.
isn't the only young Earth creationists out there. There's a
You
lot
know,
of
but my point is simply that if we're going to count you as a conservative or a progressive, it's going to depend on whose opinion counts. And that's just a reminder that these are relative contextualized terms. They're not terms that map onto two clearly distinct groups. And if you concede that, then we can begin to break down what is your concern, which is this kind of in-group, out-group binary thinking that leads us to misrepresent and dehumanize others.
I do think that it's a spectrum. I do think that there has been very tight bundles of ideas, historically and even now. Um, but I'm a person who doesn't actually fit those bundles is the issue, and so historically, yeah, if you affirmed evolution, I mean, you defined in your response to me, you define progressive Christians in a far more recent sense, almost like the post-evangelicals, or kind of this movement of evangelicals to a more liberal view is one way to put it, right? And I think that's fine, right? But if that's the case, it's far more recent. So when we talk about progressive, there are no progressive Christians 50 years ago, right? But and I actually think that's helpful. I think there's a difference, for example, a pretty important difference between neo-Orthodox, which were more liberal. People had a more liberal starting point, moving to a more conservative, versus post-evangelicals, which had a more conservative starting point, moving to a more liberal. I think there is like a pretty important difference between those two. So I think that's a good distinction. Um, I mean, I forgot where I was going with this exactly, so let me pause there. But I do think that's an important distinction you've made. What were we talking about, and how could I direct that better?
Well, let me ask this. So, at the end of the day, in your conversation with Cameron, again, I'm an insecure, thin-skinned author, but I also want to learn more about how I can improve my arguments. So, at the end of the day, at the end of your conversation, you didn't endorse the book I had written, but
Well,
you
no.
did
To be
endorse.
clear, I think anyone who reads Alyssa Childers' book should read your book.
Okay.
You said I was giving you an ad hominem by saying that you were emotional. I don't know if I used the word emotional on it. I was doing something very different, Randall. I am reading your book thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to completely trigger all the people you need to convince what you're saying here. And I'll give you some examples of that. And this is not as careful of a case as it could be. You have a much stronger case to make, like a much stronger case to make that doesn't trigger the people you need to convince. And what I was trying to explain is that uh, to give an account for that would help people take to kind of look past those issues to really get to the heart of what you were saying. That's what I was trying to do. So it's exact opposite of ad hominem. An ad hominem is me saying, look, he's emotional, so don't listen to him. What I was doing is very different. Is like, look, he has a reason to be upset. Both him and a lot of his friends are being called heretics when maybe they're not. So a lot of his case isn't as precise as it could be. So look past that as you read it, and get to the core part of what he's saying. And his core point is correct, that that progressive Christians are Christians too.
So you said two things that I triggered people that I was supposed to be reaching, which
Well, I'm
suggests,
predicting you will, and when I read it.
yeah, okay, which so that what I would want is and you also said I'm not precise, so I would say, okay, please be precise in how I wasn't precise, and give me examples of how I inappropriately triggered people where I could have communicated in a different way without
Well,
triggering them.
so this is so. But to be clear, getting back to what I was saying before, is I do think that Alyssa was wrong to say it's not Christianity or it's not Christians, and that's just too high of a statement. But progressive Christians have presented themselves as presenting a revision of historical Christianity. They presented themselves as presenting a different Christianity, and that's not necessarily anything worse than creating a new denomination. I'm not saying it is that organized, but that's how they presented themselves. And I think also there are dangers in their approach to it. Now, you might disagree with that, but that's what I think, okay? And that's what Alyssa thinks. And I think if that's how she'd framed her book, it would be far better. Now, in what you wrote, I just have to say that if without far more reduced thesis, some of the things you do, if with a person is working that far more reduced thesis in their mind, like me, some of the stuff you did really reinforces that idea. So a great example of this is how you talked about, early on in your book, you talk about Pannenberg and the virgin birth, and you talk about I forgot the name of the guy, but NT writes,
Marcus Borg.
Marcus Borg. Now to be clear, let me tell you the positive part. I agree with what you're saying. He's like, you are actually reading these guys. You're informed. You're handling them in a humane way. All right, okay. And and this is actually what helped me understand the core thing that you're really after. You're really wanting a sort of humanizing treatment across disagreement, and that's to your credit. Look, I mean, even if a person doesn't agree with the resurrection, calling them a heretic to start out with probably isn't the best way to do this. I mean, I think the right way to do it is to engage them how N.T. Wright has handled it, right? And if a person is a place of rejecting the virgin birth and affirming the resurrection like Pannenberg is, the right response isn't to call them a heretic, is to actually read what they're saying and engage with them in depth, which is what you're doing. Okay, so this is all really good, right? But at the same token, is that it's also true that they're outside the boundaries of historical Christianity in a lot of ways. I mean, Pannenberg is maybe a debatable case. I think the fact that he's neo-Orthodox is an important context as well. And so, but there's really no sense of that other side of it, of like, hey, there is an important reason to talk about what historical Christianity is. These people are outside of historical Christianity in important ways, or at the borders of it, at least, in the case Pannenberg. I know that he has an argument for why he's actually affirming the Apostles' Creed by completely redefining the meaning of the virgin birth. But I mean, like, without having any concern about that really raises a lot of red flags. Like, you don't
Okay, but
really
that's actually not true. So look, on page 14, after this, so I introduced Marcus Borg. Okay, I mean, the context, just to back up, on page 13, so I'm going through the way Alyssa Childers described the pastor who triggered her, and so this progressive pastor who triggered her like 15 years ago and shook her faith, right? And one of the things she says that he said was, quote, "The resurrection probably happened, but you don't have to believe in it." So I said, I'm going through each one of her summations of this fellow's teaching and showing how there's evidence that she's interpreting him and presenting him in an uncharitable and tendentious fashion. And so this is one of those examples. So then I give the example of Marcus Borg, who was a liberal Christian and struggled with the doctrine of the resurrection for at least a couple different reasons, including his panentheistic theology. And Wright talks about this because Wright was close friends with him and says he would still call him a Christian, even though he rejects the resurrection. And nobody understands the resurrection from a historical, perhaps as well a theological point of view as N.T. Wright. So after I introduce that, I say this: let's start by restating the obvious. The resurrection is a central dogma of Christianity that is not in question. So I am fully in tune with and highlighting the fact that Borg is outside of historic orthodoxy, and that would constitute a heresy, I think, by historic definition of Christian faith. That doesn't change the fact that we can still try to understand what he's doing charitably when she just does not.
Well, this is, I think, I'm just telling you the way that's written. Look, I'm reading you in a very friendly way, Randall. I got a lot of people reaching out to me after the Capturing Christianity interview. I was encouraging them, if they've read Elisa's book, to read yours as well too. Okay, and I would generally tell them there's going to be parts that will probably bother you, but this is what you should look past to get what he's saying here. I'm telling you, this is one of the parts. The way how you wrote it, you could have made your point a lot clearer. Um, I mean, I wish that you had an opportunity to have people like me read it. I mean, ahead of time and help you, because like the way how you do it there, it's just not clear where you stand. So I think part of it is that you're saying her central thesis is that progressive Christians are not Christians, but that's at best one half of her thesis. Her other thesis, which I think uh, you haven't given much attention to,
But I mean, on
and it
board,
hurts you. I'm telling you, it hurts your case. Is that what we should be returning to is historical Christianity?
but so I said explicitly, Borg quote, place himself outside the Orthodox community of Christian belief. I mean, I think that's as clear as could be. Okay, so now what did you just? Oh
I'm
yeah,
just saying her
you
thesis
said the
also
term
is that we should
historic.
be returning to a more
Yeah,
historically grounded Christian faith.
yeah. So this is one of the problems with her book is she uses the term historic Christianity and typically tends to map that uncritically onto her North American conservative Protestant evangelicalism. And they're not the same thing, right? Historic mere Christianity, which is the point I make clearly in the book, is not her view, which again, penal substitutionary theory of atonement, eternal conscious torment theory of posthumous judgment, those are not part of mere Christianity and they're not requirements of orthodoxy.
Look, I mean, I don't need to micromanage your book, Randall. I mean, I'm telling you, my assessment is I think that there's far better ways to make your case on that that would be helpful to her and might actually be more persuasive to people that really like her book. I mean, I can tell you how I would do parts of it, and I'm telling you parts that I think are going to really trigger people. And I think that it's because like when you're talking about these things, you're not really framing it in a way that will help. I think most Christians that are Protestant right now, for better or worse, to the extent that they're committed to historical Christianity, are fairly ignorant of it. Okay, that's just reality. That's just true of most Protestants. We're ignorant of history. Okay, and so yeah, I mean, if you don't actually give, I mean, you have to have a much more gentle, almost a Mister Rogers approach to kind of guiding people into the diversity of the church history, or they really struggle with it, or I really have struggled with it too. I mean, there's a point where my fundamentalist training really had me in this place of thinking fundamentalism was historical Christianity. Okay, and the way it does that was with incredible amnesia to actual history. Okay, and it was really a revolutionary experience of actually learning the history of thought. I mean, books like Mark Knoll's book on the scandal of the evangelical mind, actually going back and actually reading C.S. Lewis on what he said, instead of just kind of taking the image of who he was and all these things, created a pretty major revolution, frankly, in my thinking, and gave me a far more grounded faith that was, I would say, in a lot of ways, far more conservative than I got from fundamentalism. I mean, I left fundamentalism because it was too innovative in a lot of ways on it. It was trying to do things that don't make any sense from historical Christianity.
In the last few minutes, what I would like to be interested to talk about from your point of view, how you understand historic Christianity, what that is, and what the relationship is between historic Christianity and the conservative evangelicalism, I think broadly, with which you would identify.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what I'd say is that I think that Alisa is appealing to that, but she doesn't have a great deal of knowledge about the history. And I think that's where the focus should be. Where one way to help is to say, you're right that historical Christianity is the right direction. So let's talk about that and learn about that. You seem to respect C.S. Lewis. Like, he didn't actually affirm. I mean, he wasn't certain about ECT. And she did correct her views based on that. So I think what that tells you is that ECT wasn't as important to her, eternal conscious torment wasn't as important to her as historical Christianity, to her credit. And that kind of gets to what the core of her argument is. I think there's a lot of things that she's going to be correctable on, because I think the core thing for her is historical Christianity, about which she's fairly transparent about. That wasn't her starting point, and she's getting acquainted with it now. And so I think that there's a lot of acquainting that needs to happen between, Protestants in that history, and we can do that in a way that really is helpful. I mean, that's part of the reason why I talked about the Lausanne Covenant. That's one of the most important documents in evangelical Christianity. That's her type of Christianity, and it's the type of Christianity that progressive Christians are divided on. Many of them don't affirm the Lausanne Covenant, and many of them do. So I think it's a far more salient sort of explanation of the type of disagreement we're dealing with. It's not that to say that if you disagree with the Lausanne Covenant, you're not a Christian. It's just that that's actually far closer to the core debate and disagreements being had in there. And I would say, not in identically the same way, but I would say that in the same way we should be concerned about a person kind of trying to disagree with the Nicene Creed. I mean, maybe they still go to heaven. Maybe it's just heterodoxy, not heresy. Maybe all of those things are there. But I mean, that should have everyone a bit concerned if they're doing that. Maybe to a lesser extent, but up there still. I think we should be saying, and we should be thinking the same thing about the Lausanne Covenant. The fact that so many progressives are willing to dismiss that is very concerning to me. I mean, that's like a type of walking away from our shared history that there's got to be far better reasons that I've been hearing from them for doing that. And I think Alisa most likely had never even heard of a Lausanne Covenant. Okay, she never mentions it. Most progressives, I found out, have never heard of it. And when they do, they take a very dismissive view to it, which I think is very concerning. And I think it's dangerous. So that's where I think the real conversation is, if that makes any sense.
So I want to say something about Childers on Hell, and then come back to Lausanne Covenant. So is it correct? Like in her book, she equates hell with eternal conscious torment, so that if you reject eternal conscious torment, you reject hell. There's no mention in her book of annihilationism or conditional mortality. In some of her more recent interviews, I've heard that she has acknowledged that some evangelicals hold to conditional mortality or annihilation. What that tells me is that this is one of the places where she should be doing the erratum of many places, where she should point out that, in fact, she was wrong. And in her chapter on hell in the book, she incorrectly believed that to be a Christian is just to believe in eternal conscious torment. Where she still has to improve further along that way is to also come to recognize that Christians who believe in universal restoration through Christ, many of them still hold to an orthodox understanding of hell in terms of a place of posthumous judgment that is purgative and restorative rather than simply punitive.
Look,
And that is a tradition that goes back to the patristics.
Look, I don't know for sure what's on her current thinking on this, but I think that would be an example, is if she's come to realize that there are Orthodox Christians that hold to other views on ECT, that would be a place where issuing an erratum makes a ton of sense. But here's the thing: it is so outside the normal within the Christian publishing community that the only way that'll happen is if it's done and it's invited in a very kind way that doesn't shame her over it, but really is about just serving the church. And I would also say it's modeled. Like, I would say that your best chance to get her to take you seriously on that would be to really look through your own book to find out if there's anything you could issue an erratum on that you wish you had really phrased better, done better, or maybe you were just wrong on. And so, in my book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, I was calling out Biologos directly for misrepresenting the science. And I wanted them to transparently correct the stuff. They chose not to. I mean, what they've done is, a lot of people would say, is deceptive. I mean, it's very deceptive publishing practices they've used. But whatever they did, I knew it wouldn't be fair not to hold myself to just as high of a standard as I want them to. So I really put from the outset, I'm writing a book. I expect, because I'm a human person that makes mistakes, I'm going to make errors in it. And I actually put publicly what my correction policy would be. and I engaged with every scientific critic that came out about my book and addressed it. And often they were right on important points that I acknowledged and fixed. Um, the question though, Randall, is like that people would have. Well, first of all, is if you're putting policy like that, are you going to actually acknowledge anything? Well, the fact that I actually have acknowledged this stuff takes that away. I think if you want that from her, one of the best ways to really encourage that is to actually start to find a way to actually to model that in your own work. I'm not even saying there's a specific thing I'm trying to call you out on, but if you can actually model that, that's going to make it more likely and less of a shaming affair for her to do the same.
Yeah. Well, you gave an example of in terms of how I spoke about Marcus Borg, and you seem to say that I didn't highlight that his views were unorthodox. I quoted myself explicitly saying, in fact, those are unorthodox views. They place him outside of historic Orthodox Christianity. So I'm not sure what I would improve there. If you do find something specific that you think I should correct, and certainly we're going to be having another conversation in a few days, feel free to bring it up then. And I certainly, those are the kinds of things I would
I mean, I
always
could
highlight.
look through it to help you if I can. I mean, if you're actually saying you would correct it. But I wasn't reading your book from that point of view. I mean, it was more. I mean, another great example, frankly, is how you handle biologos, which actually, I mean, I was, I honestly laughed out loud when I saw how you wrote it. So first of all, you said that Pete Enns is clearly Christian, and the evidence you gave is that he was a senior. He used to be a senior fellow of Biologos that calls themselves evangelical. I'm just telling you that Biologos, um, in the origins debate, is considered Christian by everyone, but everyone has major objections to their theological position because it's too progressive. And also, some of the people who've been used to be
The issue,
associated with
but the issue,
Logos are also ex Christians now too. So just
the
because
issue is not whether Pete Enns should be considered an evangelical by some group, right? The issue was whether he should be considered a Christian, and I gave multiple lines of evidence.
it's
So,
very
including
easy to show that
not,
he's a Christian. It's very easy to show that he's a
but that
Christian.
was the
I'm telling
central
you, you don't
argument of
have
her
to
book.
write chapters and chapters on that argument.
I didn't
That
write chapters and
undermines you.
chapters.
Just simply pointing out that he affirms these things. I mean, you have a friendship with them. You can get on the phone. Do you affirm the Nicene Creed? Do you affirm the Apostles' Creed? Do you affirm the Lasan Covenant? Where do you disagree with it? If he disagrees with it, if it's just about inerrancy, then my goodness, this guy is.
But I did point that out in the book. I pointed out that he affirms the statement of Eastern University where he teaches annually that he's an Episcopalian, that he was
That's
involved with
fine, but I'm just
Biologos,
telling you.
that his book is praised by conservatives like Tremper Longman. All of those are lines of evidence that show that he is a Christian, contrary to the false thesis of Alisa Childers.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, the reduced thesis is that he is a different type of Christian that has dangerous theology. Now, that's a far more reduced one. That's not the precise argument she made, but that's how I would revise what she's saying. And that's what I'm working through as I go through this. I'm like, well, wow. That's how a lot of people, frankly, are going to be reading this. They're not. Well, I mean, whether or not you call them Christians is kind of a side issue. The question is their theology dangerous? And to associate them with biologos that way, in that way, I mean, it's just, if you're dealing with the reduced thesis that I just gave you, which is far more defensible, then your argument really falls apart.
My argument is for the book that this is for the argument that this is another gospel. That's the book I wrote in response to the book where she argues it's another gospel. If you want to argue, well, okay, it's not another gospel, but some progressives hold doctrines that might be dangerous. Sure, we could argue that. That would be a different topic. And so to say my argument falls apart against a
But I
topic
think
I wasn't
that's
addressing
just the
is really a non
obvious
sequitur.
revision. That's just the obvious revision of, or the obvious correction of Alyssa Childer's case. So obvious that I think a lot of people reading it are thinking that. I mean, that's how
And I would
read it.
argue that her theology is dangerous. As I pointed out in the book, her
That's
theology
fine.
has
But
Gnostic
we
elements.
can have that debate. But I'm just saying the
Yeah,
argument of
one of the
associating them with
aspects.
biologos, that's just, look. I think this whole thing about are you guys Christians or not is absurd. I think you guys are Christians. Um,
And
you
you're a
know,
Christian. right?
Yeah,
You're a
that's not
Christian,
the
even though
issue.
you're a progressive according to some people, like
Well,
Answers
I'm
in
not a
Genesis.
progressive, I would tell them, and I'll give them very clear reasons why. Look, I mean, this is an issue that even Bill Craig had in his book that came out
Sure.
on Adam and Eve. So I don't know if have you been following the debate about that much?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read it, but I've been following it from
Well, it's
afar.
interesting because
Yeah.
he talks about Genesis being mytho-history, and the forward of his book is worth reading because, like, a lot of us have been struggling with the right way to explain what this particular divide is. And the language he comes to is, which I don't think is necessarily the end all be all, but I do think it's helpful, is he kind of avoids conservative versus liberal. He kind of avoids a lot of different things. But he says really what the divide is about traditionalists versus revisionists. That's kind of how he's framing it. And that I think actually has some salience in this conversation. And so I think better than even calling me a conservative or a fundamentalist, I mean, calling maybe a traditionalist makes more sense. My concern with post-evangelicals and biologos and Pete Enns that doesn't apply, for example, to the neo-orthodox is that they're revisionists. So it's interesting. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot. Is that, when you look at a person like Karl Barth, I disagree with him on key things, but you can see his fundamental movement is towards historical Christianity from a very modernist context.
I mean, I would be careful with neo-Orthodox as a category because Rudolf Bultmann was neo-Orthodox, and he denied pretty much all historical claims about Jesus beyond that he existed and died.
Well, it doesn't mean that I think they're all Orthodox. I mean, I think Pannenberg was neo-Orthodox too. He's in a particular
I
place, but I
wouldn't
think
call I wouldn't call Pannenberg
what would
neo-Orthodox.
you
That
call
was
him?
another thing. I mean, he comes after neo-Orthodoxy in the early 1960s with Revelation and History. So he's one of these historical theologians like Moltmann, somewhat of a different approach.
Well, maybe
He's much more like the neo-Orthodox were deeply influenced, if we even use that term, by a strong emphasis, I think, upon an existential theology influenced by Kierkegaard. And I think Pannenberg was much more trying to be scientific and objective in his
okay.
approach.
You're talking about this on a finer grain, more informed way than me. So maybe you can help me clarify my language. Look, I think the fundamentalist modernist debate has been a very helpful framework for me. Okay. When I look at people like Karl Barth and Pannenberg and a lot of these people, I'm kind of looking at them in many ways like N.T. Wright might. Okay, hey, they're making a movement towards historical Christianity, which is where I think the right direction is. But their starting point is pretty far away from it with the modernists. But but the movement is in the right direction. So a lot of the places I disagree with them can actually be explained in light of kind of what their starting point was. You know what I mean? And that's like a far more sympathetic way to understand them. All right. In contrast, when I see a person kind of trying to do a revision instead of a return to that's a lot harder. Even if they end up in a place that's identical to Karl Barth in terms of the actual positions, what they're doing is making a case for revisions that I really don't think are necessary. And so that ends up being a very different sort of scholarship and case. And so, Karl Barth is maybe inheriting things I disagree with from modernism. That's very different than a person arguing for changes to historical Christianity that I disagree with. So
Well,
there's like a difference in
Emil
terms of
Brunner,
directionality.
Emil
What?
Brunner also rejected the virgin birth, for example, and he was neo-Orthodox. And Brunner and Barth would have had no time for a concept like biblical inerrancy.
Well, yeah,
So
I would agree with you. But like I'm saying, this is. I think that's. I think that is one of the dynamics at play here. Like for me, it is historical Christianity. Not saying that I fully understand it. That's why I'm here to actually learn from historical theology what historical Christianity was. But I think that has a really important role and kind of helping us understand what has been the testimony of church through history that we're kind of taking forward now. And I think that all else being equal, that historical views of theology and of scripture really should be maintained, unless there's a very good reason to move away from them. And I don't think that the arguments for revision that I hear from progressives are compelling at all. I mean, when I read Greg Beale, the part that he actually made the most sense to me about, and it just seems to be entirely true, not just of Pete Enns, but about many of the progressives I've dealt with, is that they just seem to be unaware and unengaged at times in their writing, even though they might be personally aware of it, with how thoughtful traditionalists have been thinking about it. And
Well,
if that's how they're making their case for revision, I just don't think that's very strong.
if you want to ever reconsider reading the history of the Canaanite genocide, read my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites.
I generally like your work, Randall, is the
Yeah.
thing. So I would love to read that. And that's one of those places too where I mean it's interesting. I don't think that progressives are entirely wrong. Look, a huge part of my public ministry has been helping Christians come to terms with evolution. Right? That's something that historically has been associated with liberal Christianity, right? So in that sense, like you're saying, maybe I'm a liberal, but I would just say that I've done it from the point of view of not saying we need to revise historical Christianity, but we need to reclaim it.
Mhm.
And I think that has been a case that has worked really well among conservative Christians and to the befuddlement of fundamentalists.
I would just want to, I mean, one thing on that, and then I want to just come back to Lao San, and we'll draw it to a close. I would just want to recognize that when people like Childers talk about historic Christianity, they tend to talk about it in a very static, inert way, as if there's this one thing that exists down through time and never changes, and that's just not true. So,
I
for
agree.
example, when you talk about an evolutionary model of creation, that has some significant theological impact on what Christianity is going to look like going forward, and so the doctrine of creation in the 21st century is going to be different than it was in the 18th century. And the more that we recognize that there can be this kind of development and progress in theology, the better we'll
But
be.
I'm
And we're
not
not going
actually
to.
sure if what you just said is true. I'm not. I mean, I've been dealing with a lot of people in the precise space, and I'm telling you that the people who've made the argument that we do have to change our doctrine of creation have usually presented really bad science along it and misunderstood really what the historical doctrine has been. Uh, I don't know what the change has to be. It seems like there's a great deal of far more continuity than any discontinuity. So, I mean, I'd be curious.
Well, something like understanding what the image of God is, understanding what it means for to create after their own kinds, understanding God's ongoing providential action in the world. I mean, all of these things are inherently interlaced with one's science on these things as well,
Yeah,
and
but those
they're
aren't.
impacted either
But what
way.
do you mean by that? Like, so what you're describing, this is like one of those places where I mean, I feel like maybe some better dialogue might be helpful because I'm telling you, like, that sounds like you're kind of alluding to, especially when you mention kinds, to young Earth creationism. That's not the historical position of the church in a theological sense, in any meaningful way. The idea of like fixity of kinds is a very novel concept. I mean, I wouldn't really say that that is the doctrine of creation. I mean, part
But
of
it certainly isn't that human beings share common ancestry with other creatures.
so have you read my book yet?
I haven't. No.
I, you know, hey, how
If
about this?
yeah,
I'll read your
let
book on
yeah,
Canaanites. You read my book on that.
yeah, we'll do a book swap, and then we'll have
Because
a
I'll tell you what,
dialogues
man,
afterwards.
I think that you may be unduly influenced, honestly, by some really big misunderstandings in the science that have been out there in public.
I'm just yeah, I'll fair enough, but I am talking about creation. So another big change to move from the geocentric to heliocentric model that changed how we understand things like the nature of the afterlife, the doctrine of the ascension, doctrine of heaven. All of those things are
Better
impacted.
example, I mean, I think a far more fundamental one was when they discovered people living on the other side of the earth. Um, you know, that was a huge deal 500 years ago. Yeah, so I mean, I think the geocentrist one wasn't as strong though. So I think what's interesting about that is I had thought the geocentric one was a big deal, but that actually is kind of a bit more wrapped up in like this false history of the conflict thesis. But the church fathers didn't really make many statements about this at all. But all the church fathers were basically clear that maybe the earth is a globe, but there wasn't people living on the other side. They were made explicit statements against that being in direct conflict with scripture. And
But
then of course,
I'm not talking about flat earthism. I'm talking about the fixity of the material universe at the center and the sun going around it. And once you flip that around,
yeah, I know that wasn't actually that I don't think that was as big of a deal because there wasn't so many church father statements against it as it was, and in fact, even as they're talking about this, and like in Kepler's Nova Morganum. No, sorry, not Nova Morganum. Nova Astronomia Nova, where he talks his key book in the scientific revolution. It's like three key books. That's one of them. He mentions specifically as kind of a precursor to his work of the fixity. I mean, kind of dealing with that about the Earth moving. He's talking about how there's being people on the other side of the Earth as being one of the core parts of that theological story. I think that was a far more unsettling uh, realization, just because there were so many direct statements against it by the church fathers. Do you know what I mean, or you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah. And if exotheology is vindicated and there's life on other planets, that would have a theological impact on a doctrine of creation too. I think I just want to recognize that there can be development in the doctrine of creation with respect to our changing understanding of
Yeah.
nature.
So historical Christianity, I would agree, does not mean that if in some sort of naive sense, I found a Christian from a long time ago who believes something, therefore that's what historical Christianity is. That's not what it is. I would say it's rather um, like a careful story or conversation we're part of that has been developing over time. So I'm in
Right.
agreement with you on that.
Okay, so let's wrap that bit up by saying we're going to read each other's books, and I'd love to have you back for a couple conversations to debrief each one of those books because this has been a lot of fun. If you're okay
Yeah,
with that, it
Randall, I
might be in a
really, I
while.
really appreciate your work and what you're doing and who you
Yeah,
are. So I would love to have those conversations.
awesome. Okay, I want to come back and just want to kind of wrap it up with again the big question of historic Christianity, mere Christianity. They're clearly interlaced as concepts. Why now? I think Lausanne is a fine statement. It seems to be very important to you. Why is that a statement that you've kind of chosen as a plumb line of orthodoxy or theological health?
Well, I didn't say it was a marker of theological health or orthodoxy. Um, I said it. Look, I mean, I think the fact that it's negotiated is important. Its purpose is helpful. It's really about how do we work. I mean, who is sufficiently similar to us that we can work together in missions. That's actually the salient question that a lot of people underlying are asking. It's not really about is that person going to hell or not, or it's really about are you similar enough that we can work together. That's actually the pragmatic question. I think it really is. I mean, it used to be called neo evangelicalism, but now it's just evangelicalism. It is kind of really like the very recent heritage that we have as evangelicals, or Christians, and that includes across the spectrum, that includes progressive Christians too, right? It's just part of our forgotten heritage. And it also is very strongly rooted not in America, but in global Christianity. I'm an Indian immigrant. My parents were born in India. I was born in the United States. I think on these debates that are generally dominated by white North Americans going back and forth against each other, there is something really corrective from the global church on this stuff. And the Lausanne Covenant is a place where the global church spoke with unison about something. And so, look, I'm not saying we need to treat it as God's word and never disagree with any single point of it. But that should be like something that we're really rediscovering now, instead of really trying to reinvent the wheel on all this stuff. Now, maybe we adjust things from there. Maybe we debate things about it. But I think a lot of the struggle that's happening right now in Alyssa Childer's book with you, it has to do with forgetting that history. Like, frankly, if people had picked that up from the beginning, and if progressives had been more in touch with it as well, maybe we'd be in a far less contentious situation right now.
Okay. One thing I'll just say to conclude is, again, I want to keep this kind of in the center, is that Lausanne was concerned with providing a definition of evangelical rather than Christianity per se. So I think it's a fine statement, but one's interest in it or commitment to it or the deference they would grant to it would probably be conditioned by their interest in identifying as an evangelical. But that said,
Well,
I
there's a
think
lot of
it's a good
people
statement.
who would affirm it, but still have a problem with evangelical.
Sure.
So part of it, it's all very contextual, right?
Yeah.
So evangelical has come to mean something very, very different in the United States and the political climate, and it's not a theological definition, to be clear. There's people that are not even Orthodox Christians that will call themselves evangelical. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and so people are trying to distance themselves from that. Fine, whatever, but that's not how global Christianity understands the term evangelical.
Yeah.
And and there's a certain arrogance that comes into it if we think that just merely the American context alone is the only context that matters for defining that term. I think that that's absurd. So I'm just saying that you can still choose an American context not to identify with the evangelical, while seeing there's legitimacy in Lausanne within a global context. So and
Sure.
you can still be a Christian even if you reject it. It's just like a different type of Christian in important ways.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I would say. Does that make any sense? Or
Yeah. No, I agree with that. All right. This has been a lot of fun. What
it's
I
been
love.
helpful, I would say
Yeah.
too. Like
Yeah.
Randall, we're going to be talking more. Like Cameron's. I just hope. Well, we can talk about that after we turn off the recording too. So.
Sure. But yeah, I like that we don't have to pull punches. We can speak plainly and we can disagree ironically and have a great, I think, conversation that produces more light than heat, which sadly is often not the norm these days. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right.